Good evening and welcome to this program presented by the Gwinnett County Public Library and our Meet the Author series. My name is Denise, and I'm the Adult Programming and Community Partnership Coordinator for the library system. I want to begin this evening by thanking our extremely important sponsors, above all, Eagle Eye Bookshop, Diane and Doug Robinson. They very generously give a percentage of all the book sales tonight back to the library to support these kinds of programs, so we love them very much. Number two, I want to welcome the GCPL History Book Club members. Thank you for picking our authors' books and for coming out tonight to support us. I want to thank the Five Forks Nonfiction Book Club, and those ladies have a table over there, and I thank them for coming and supporting this program and reading our authors' books. We thank National Geographic Publications for sending us this author. We thank Andy and Kate of the Norcross Culture Arts Center for donating the use of this center for the library functions. We are most appreciative. And finally, I thank the Friends of the Gwinnett County Public Library, who are all the volunteers that are here tonight making this possible. There's only 2 paid employees. Everybody else has most graciously given of their time. And I'd particularly like to introduce Catherine Rigsby, the new president of the Friends of the Library. Would you stand up? Thank you, Catherine. Folks, we hope to see you in January for Brad Taylor. We hope to have you at our luncheon in January. It's a bit of a romance between the covers, book covers. Eloise James, a very famous romance writer. And then in February, Tim Dorsey, who is absolutely hysterical. There are flyers back on the Friends table to keep you informed about that. And if you join the Friends, you could get some nice reserved seats. And it's very inexpensive, and you're supporting the library, so consider it. What we're going to do this evening is Mr. Groom is going to talk for about a half an hour, and then he's going to take your questions. If you have a question, I'm going to ask that you walk up to the microphone here so that he can hear you. The acoustics are not great in here. And that way he'll be able to hear your question, and he'll take questions for about a half hour, followed by a book signing, which will be here on the stage. So when he finishes, we thank you all. We'll have him sit down, and then we'll line up over here for the signing. He'll stay until you're done. So no need to jam into the line. If you have more than 5 books, we ask that you be gracious and consider going to the back of the line, so those who have just one or two don't have to wait as long. It's just classy. Anyway, I thank you all for coming. We're so happy to have you. And I present Merwin Chambers, the treasurer of the Friends of the Gwinnett County Public Library, who will introduce the author, Merwin Chambers.
Good evening, and thanks again for coming. As Denise said, I am the treasurer of the Friends of the Gwinnett County Public Library. And in addition to working events like this, you'll see us around. We've got white shirts mostly and black pants. We're back at the welcoming table, as well as manning the silent auction and the refreshment table. I would like to encourage all of you to join the Friends if you have not already joined. In addition to working events like this, we've tried to promote literacy and love of books. We support the children's, teen, and adult reading programs, and try to promote the library through advocacy and in other ways. It's $15 a year for an individual membership or $20 for a family membership. And I hope you'll consider joining. Winston Groom took the publishing world by storm when his 1986 novel Forrest Gump came out. It flew to the top of the New York Times bestseller list and stayed there for 21 weeks. It has sold millions of copies worldwide and was, of course, the source of the blockbuster movie adaptation starring Tom Hanks. Mr. Groom is also the author of Conversations with the Enemy, a nonfiction account of the experience of an American prisoner of war in Vietnam, a brilliantly rendered Pulitzer Prize finalist. As well as being a talented novelist, Mr. Groom is also a renowned author of history. He's a recipient of the Harper Lee Award for Literature, the Heartland Award, and the Southern Library Award for Fiction. We are most fortunate to have him with us tonight while he's on a tour of his newest book, The Generals, Patton, MacArthur, Marshall, and winning World War II. Please welcome Mr. Groom.
Good evening. My first reaction here is, in every place almost that I've been making speeches, and whether it's the day show or the night show, whatever, they have a green room. And one does not necessarily expect a green room at smaller venues, but let me tell you, there's a green room right in here that I just... And the reason it's green is that there are gaming tables propped up against the wall with green. I'm shocked in a church to find these gaming tables. But anyway, look, I am so pleased that you guys turned out tonight to come here. One never knows what one's going to get, and I got a nice crowd, I'm sure. Yeah, I like to think that these three generals that I'm writing about, General Douglas MacArthur, General George Patton, General George Marshall, people have asked me, good, all right, we'll get it there somewhere. Is that better in the back? Good. Well, yeah, I've been on this sort of book tour, they call it, for a couple of weeks, and I get asked a lot of questions, and a lot of them over and over. And one of them is, why did I select these three generals to write about? And I like to think it's because the book itself is about character and courage and patriotism, which are traits that have seemed somewhat diminished in modern times. I don't know about that for sure, because you'd almost have to have a big war to find out. God knows we don't need that. But they were iconic in the World War II, meaning that the only year we could have lost that war was 1942. That's my judgment. We were, first part of 1942, we were pretty beaten up. And in the last part of 1942, General MacArthur in the Pacific and General Patton well, at that point he was in North Africa, and General Marshall, who was in the middle, keeping both of them from trying to implode on themselves, they began winning this wonderful string of victories that helped the American spirit, which had been really down from Pearl Harbor on through some of these big defeats that we had had early on in the war. So that's why I chose them. And another question, and this is not really in my little speech that I typed out here, but having been on the road and on the radio and on the TV, people have asked me is, what do you think that if these three generals were alive and active in the military today, what would they do about the situation that we have? And that, of course, is all the more pertinent with the unfortunate events in Paris over the weekend. And I'm not clairvoyant, and nobody could figure out what they could do, but my guess is they would assemble a reinforced, mechanized United States Army Infantry Division, which consists of about 15 to 20,000 of the most well-trained, well-armed, meanest son of a guns on the planet. And they would go over there with these ISIS people and go through them in about a week. there are about 6 of these outfits scattered around the country, drawing pay every day and doing their training, doing their maintenance and so on. But the fact is that these generals, General MacArthur, General Patton, General Marshall, whatever, it's not their job to do that, to do that unless they're told to do it by the administration. And I'm not going to remark any further on that. We don't seem to have an administration that is interested in that sort of approach. And what I'm looking at is the danger of letting these people consolidate, these ISIS, consolidate their conquest and intended conquest in the Middle East with all of the financial assets and the oil and the banks and the whatever else that they have, so that they can do, I mean, it would make what happened in Paris look like child's play. They would get weapons of mass destruction. I think at some point, somebody has to go over there and take those people out. But anyway, that's just my opinion, and I'm going to keep it to myself. Thank you. You know, Patton and MacArthur were West Pointers, and George Marshall was a VMI general, Virginia Military Institute. They distinguished themselves, each of them, in their own way. They were 19th century men, and they fought in the Philippines insurrections in 1909. Patton fought along the Mexican border in 1914 and 16. MacArthur fought in the Mexican, there was a smaller Mexican incident in 1912 where MacArthur was actually put in for the Congressional Medal of Honor, but because what he did was not authorized by his superiors, it was denied it, but what he did was extraordinary. He felt that we were landing in Veracruz, the Americans. So we had no way to get around the country and need a railroad. So he got on a handcar with 3 other guys and went deep into enemy territory on this handcar to try to find where the Mexicans had hidden their engines. And when he found out, he went back on the handcar and was attacked about 5 or 6 times by these hordes of Mexican, what you call them, revolutionaries on horseback. And he killed any number of them with his pistol. He was a great pistol shot. And the result was he reported back to his superiors where the train cars were. And they put him in for the medal, but anyway, he didn't get it. But the point I'm trying to make here is that all 3 of these guys had distinguished themselves even before World War I. And after World War I, and during that, they had become great heroes. I mean, they were young guys, but to the American people, they were pretty well known at that point. They were also husbands and fathers who, after the First World War, some of them spent their time in limbo. General Patton in particular, General Marshall in particular, going to military schools and doing what you do, but General MacArthur, on the other hand, had become the youngest general in the United States Army during the First World War, and he didn't revert to rank, so to speak, meaning when you get a military rank during a war, it's often a brevet rank, meaning that you have to go back to your old rank once the war is over. Well, they made General MacArthur the youngest superintendent of West Point, and then they made him the youngest chief of staff of the United States Army. And then in the late 1930s, he was asked by the president of the Philippines if he could create an army and defenses in the Philippine Islands that would either prevent Japan from attacking them or defeat Japan if they did. And he told them, well, it will take 10 years, and I will try to do it. And so they made him a sort of field marshal of the Philippine armies, which we have no field marshals in the American Army, but it's a big deal. And so he ran out of time. He had about 5 or 6 years to do it. And likewise, George Marshall had a enormous talent for organization. He didn't have to stay in the Army. After the First World War, he was given probably a dozen offers by some of the greatest financial institutions in America, including becoming a vice president of J.P. Morgan and Company, which would have made him a multimillionaire by the time he was done. But he was a soldier, and he turned that down, and that was very patriotic of him, I think. General Patton, on the other hand, was the richest man in the Army. And he didn't have to be in the Army either. He just wanted to be in the Army. He'd come to various posts in the far-flung, in the Midwest and places like that, with a string of polo ponies in a yacht. And he was a young lieutenant, you know. But his fellow officers didn't begrudge him that because he was the best polo player in the Army. And he was the best yachtsman in the Army. And, you know, Patton was interesting. From his early childhood, he was dyslexic. And so in order to overcome it, he learned to memorize by rote very complicated mathematical problems and essays in literature, and that's what got him through West Point. He struggled the entire time, but he made it through simply by dint of an ability to overcome his disability, which I think makes it all the more interesting. He used to joke about it. One time he was making a talk to his men, and everybody knew his spelling was atrocious. And he said, you know, anybody can spell a word the same way all the time. He said, it doesn't take He said, it takes a genius. You know, it takes eventually to spell. I spell a word 5 or 6 different ways. So, Patton went in 1912. He went to the Olympics in an event called a pentathlon. It was held in Stockholm, Sweden. And he was the only American to enter that event. And he was the first United States Army West Point Academy graduate to enter any event in the Olympics. The pentathlon was an old Greek, they resurrected it from the Greek pentathlon, where the theory was you had a courier, and the courier had to learn to ride and sword fight and swim, and he was trying to get through enemy lines. And it was about 7 or 8 different events. And in the Greek version of it, the old Greek version of it, many of these men were killed. That's the way they liked to do it. But the new version, they didn't have anybody killed. It was perfectly safe to do it, but it was very, very strenuous. And Patton was tailor-made for the job. He had been a track star at West Point. He was one of the best shots in the Army. He was, of course, the best rider in the Army. He was the best swordsman in the Army. Matter of fact, they had a title for him called Master of the Sword, and he invented the new U.S. cavalry saber. They call it the Patton saber. And he also had learned to swim because in his youth he had swum around Catalina Island, which his family owned. And out of about, I think, 48 contestants who ran that pentathlon, Patton placed number 8. There was a fluke about it, about his shooting, which it seemed he got less points because everybody but the judges thought that one of his bullets had gone through the hole of the other bullet on the target. But they couldn't prove it, so they took his score down. But anyway, he made friends in that competition that lasted a lifetime. And that was the kind of guy Patton was. He was a great guy for old friendships. In World War I, Patton got involved in tanks, which were very new then, and he stayed involved in tanks. He gave up his precious cavalry assignment to become a tanker. And during the 1930s, of course, the Army was very squeezed in the Depression, and He paid a man who ran a company in New Jersey out of his own pocket to develop new and better prototypes of tanks. I think each of these guys had something they felt they had to live up to. In MacArthur's case, his father had not only been a general in the Army, he was the winner of the Congressional Medal of Honor. And actually, it became later the head of the Army. But in his youth, MacArthur spent his time in these far-flung outposts in the West, in Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, where they were still fighting the Indians in the 1880s. And he remembers as a child seeing flaming arrows coming over the walls of the forts where his father was posted, and going out in the desert and actually seeing bands of Indians. And he said he learned to ride and shoot before he could read and write. Marshall, General Marshall's father, and General Marshall, remember, was the Chief of Staff of the Army, was a successful businessman in Pennsylvania until his businesses failed. And I think General Marshall spent the rest of his life trying to be the best organized person in the entire world, somehow either to atone for that or to try to prevent it in his own life, because he had a superb reputation, General Marshall, as being able to organize everything in, it's amazing. I could bore you with it because I don't think I'd bore you with it in the book, but it'd take too long to explain it right now. Now, Patton, General Patton's father was a VMI graduate, as several generations of Patton had been VMI graduates. And he was a successful lawyer in California, but his age was such that he missed all the wars. It just came the wrong time for him. But Patton's grandfather had been a Confederate general and was killed in one of the last actions of the Civil War. And Patton had heard these stories all of his life from his aunt and his father, and somehow from the day he was born almost, he was born a soldier. And he wanted to go to West Point. The dyslexia caused him to take a year off, use VMI as a prep school. So he not only went to VMI for a year before he went to West Point, but he failed his first year at West Point and had to repeat it. But he was determined to get through this, and indeed he did, and he came through with pretty flying colors. But he was always complicated by this aura of his grandfathers. All of his not only his grandfather, but all of his great uncles were high up officers in the Confederate Army. And Pat was always afraid that they were in heaven, because everybody in his family was going to go to heaven, and he thought that. They were looking down on him and worried that he was going to be a coward. And so to compensate for that, he became one of the most dangerous officers on earth, because he constantly exposed himself to fire. Once during the First World War, during the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne, which was one of probably now the worst battle I believe this country's ever fought, we had 26,000 United States Army soldiers killed in that thing. And Patton and MacArthur ran into each other on the battlefield when a fight was going on. And all the men were lying down in trenches and foxholes and whatever, and they two were standing up having a conversation. And a rolling barrage was coming at them. They could see it coming. And they stood there all the way through the rolling barrage having their conversation. And Patton later wrote his wife, he said, I think both of us wanted to hit the dirt, but neither one of us wanted to be the first one to say so. MacArthur likewise was said to be, rather than always worried about whether he was brave or cowardly, MacArthur was simply oblivious to it somehow. And nobody knew how he'd do it. And this went on all through his career. When he was in the Philippines, his staff was horrified, or even when he was in New Guinea, and he was a 50, 60-year-old man. He would simply, if he wanted to go to the battlefield, or get in a Jeep and go do it, and there were bullets going everywhere. And I think his theory was, well, if the name of the bullet is on me, that's the way it is. Otherwise, I'm going to carry on my business. And his staff would just, one time they had to lure him back to a battleship which was lying offshore with the promise of chocolate ice cream, which he liked very much. They said, General, you would offend the captain if you don't come back in time for the meal he's prepared for you. In the Philippines, he was absolutely mortified when he had to leave his army in 1942 to be sacrificed to the Japanese. But there was no way that our government, the United States government, could come to its relief. From all of the battleships were in the bottom of Pearl Harbor, and we didn't have the army to do it at that point. And MacArthur was told that they were coming, but they never did. And finally, Franklin Roosevelt said to him, you got to leave, because they didn't want MacArthur to be captured with the rest of the army and, walked in chains through the streets of Tokyo, hanged, or whatever they were going to do to him. And so they, of course, the famous story, they got him out on a PT boat and later an airplane to Australia, where he was given the command of the Southwest Pacific. In order to allay any concerns about MacArthur being a coward, leaving his army, Roosevelt ordered him, finally, he got his Congressional Medal of Honor, like his father. And he thought that would do it. And MacArthur, for his part, told the press when he got there, he said, I shall return. And this immediately became an iconic slogan all the way throughout the United States, because we had been losing fights that whole first half of 1942. And suddenly, I shall return, people would, it was on cigarette lighters engraved, it was on matchbooks, it was on ashtrays and coffee cups, and people scrawled it on the walls of latrines. I shall return. And return he did. It took him 3 years and tens of thousands of soldiers' casualties. But he developed a brilliant strategy that was not in the military book at that time of not island hopping, but bypassing islands where there were Japanese strongholds that he thought he could safely leave in his rear and let the Marines and other Army, the pilots, take care of them so that they don't bother me. And he could move faster that way and have much fewer casualties, and he did. He was clearly in the Pacific the most brilliant commanding officer that there was there. Patton, meantime, began make a name for himself in North Africa, where he commanded the American landing in Morocco, where the enemy wasn't the Germans or the Italians, it was the French. It was the Vichy French, who were sort of a paper outfit that was run by the French government in Vichy. It was under control of the Germans, and the French had been a colony in Morocco, and they occupied Morocco. They had hoped to not have any trouble from these people. But when the landings commenced, the Vichy French began firing at the troops on the shore with cannons and machine guns and so forth. And Patton got ashore finally, and he sent a messenger, a colonel, to see the Vichy commander in Casablanca. And the message was, if you don't surrender by 5 o'clock, I'm going to have my naval guns level this city. It won't be anything left tomorrow morning. And they believed him, and they stopped fighting. As a matter of fact, they joined up with the Americans, which was big, because there were about 250,000 of these Vichy French in various French colonies over there. Patton, he went through ultimately Morocco and the rest of the Mediterranean countries, and he came to Sicily, and they crossed over, and Patton led that charge and conquered Sicily, and then was sent to England to have some part in the Normandy invasion. But of course there was that famous slapping incident where he completely lost control of himself, and he slapped a soldier because the soldier said something like he had combat fatigue, and Patton had gone to a hospital where there were many badly wounded men. Saw this young boy on a bed, said, "What's wrong with you?" And he said he just couldn't take it anymore. And Patton went berserk. And I mean, it's not only against military law for an officer to lay a hand on a enlisted man. It's stupid, but he did it. And I think he was sorry afterwards that he did it, but it was reported by the doctors in the hospital to General Eisenhower, who was running the invasion, and General Eisenhower actually sat on it. He put that report in his safe. But unfortunately, it got out to the press. And there was a huge scandal back home of Patton slapping soldiers and so on, which the press is, wont to do sometimes. And General Eisenhower had to do something, so he actually proposed firing General Patton. But General Marshall, who was the chief of staff, and smart enough to realize that people like General Patton and General MacArthur, no matter how disagreeable they were to the brass in Washington, were indispensable to the war effort. And so he told General Eisenhower that he should not fire General Patton. But what they did was they made him go around to the hospital, find the hospital staff, the soldier he slaps, the nurses, the doctors who were present, and personally apologize, which he did, and then to apologize to every division in his army, which he did, one unit at a time. But toward the end of that, the soldiers knew what was coming, and to show you how much they respected General Patton, as he began to apologize, they would say, "No, no, no," and literally drive him off the stage in tears. But he was a difficult guy. Both General Patton and General MacArthur had enormous egos. Fortunately for them, General Marshall had practically no ego. He could have appointed himself the head of the invasion of Europe. Instead, he appointed General Eisenhower because President Roosevelt had said to him, "I would really prefer you to stay here." He didn't order him to do it. And General Marshall, all of his life, all of his military career, had yearned for nothing more than to command a large army in combat. But he turned it down and he stayed in Washington, because he knew, actually, I think, that that's where his services would have been better. After the war, General Patton was assigned to command the occupation of Bavaria, which is, I think, the largest state in Germany. He disobeyed General Eisenhower's order to not have any of the former Nazis take part in the government. His attitude about it was, General Patton's attitude was, we have a whole bunch of millions of people, we got a big winter coming on, and these are the only people that know what to do. And so he disobeyed that order, and for that he was fired. He wasn't actually fired. The newspaper said he was fired. He was relieved and given command of the 12th Army, which was more or less a paper army. It was designed to write the history of the Second World War. And shortly after that, he was going to go home. And he'd gone on a pheasant hunt, just a couple of days before he was supposed to leave. And he'd gone on a pheasant hunt in Bavaria with a fellow general, and they were in the back of an Army staff car, big Cadillac, painted OD green, olive drab. And as they were crossing a railroad track, a truck coming from the opposite direction veered out and struck the left fender of this staff car. And nobody was hurt. The driver wasn't hurt. The other general wasn't hurt. But General Patton, for some reason, propelled up, and there was a thing that had to do with the glass partition between the back seat, the driver, and the back seat. And it struck him right here, and it paralyzed him from the neck down. And he was perfectly conscious, cursed a little bit, asked for some whiskey, was taken to the hospital, and of course the surgeons knew that this was a very serious thing, and they sent for the chief of neurosurgery of the Army there at Walter Reed, and he came within a day, as did General Patton's wife. And the doctor looked at the x-rays, and then he looked at General Patton, and General Patton said to him, well, do you think how serious is this? And he, well, it's pretty serious, but you survived so far, most people don't. And he said, well, do you think I can ride a horse again? And the doctor said, no. And General Patton said, well, thank you. I appreciate your candor. And they gave him a ration of, I think about 3 drinks. He liked Johnny Walker Black Label. And they gave him 3 drinks a day, and he lived for about a week, and then he expired. And this was an accident. There's a lot of stuff flying around out there today about he was assassinated. How the heck do you assassinate somebody with an automobile? That's nuts. I mean, he died a natural, unfortunate, accidental death. In his case, it probably was the best thing, because he was a warrior, and there were no more battles to be fought for him. But today he's buried in the great American cemetery in Luxembourg. If you ever get there, look him up. General MacArthur was assigned to somehow revitalize Japan. And it was prostrate. Tokyo was leveled by firebombs, all the atomic bombs. They bombed everything. The Japanese people were I think General MacArthur said in his autobiography, they seemed to be looking for something, but they didn't know what it was. And very slowly, General MacArthur started putting the country back again on a footing to bring them into the company of Western nations. He created for the first time in their existence a democracy. And he lifted all of these strange rules and bans on women. And he did what he could to get the businesses going. The factories were prostrate at that point. And so I remember when I was young, there were little tiny pieces of China that said "Made in Occupied Japan" on the bottom of them. But he did that for 5 years. When they held the first election, the embarrassed Japanese had to report to General MacArthur that a prostitute had been elected to the Diet, which was like their parliament. And General MacArthur said, well, how many votes did she get? And they said 250,000. And he said, well, she must have been doing something right. But then around 1950, the North Koreans, communist North Korea, invaded South Korea, and the United States and the allies, its allies in World War II, had promised to protect it. General MacArthur was put into a terrible position because he didn't have an army. I mean, it was just scattered units here and there, but he put it together He stopped the rout. He then organized one of the most brilliant tactical moves probably in the history of modern warfare, the landing of troops at Incheon, which is a port near Seoul. At that point, they drove the North Korean army back up to North Korea, and there was a squabble about how far you could go, because President Truman was trying to have a negotiated peace. Suddenly, the Chinese army of hundreds of thousands start pouring in, and MacArthur was in a pretty bad situation, and he managed to stop that invasion. And then he committed professional suicide. I don't know why. I don't think anybody knows why today, but General MacArthur was under, as were all the high military people, under an edict from President Truman, that said, you cannot say anything publicly without clearing it through the White House. And so what MacArthur did, without clearing it through the White House, while President Truman was trying to negotiate a truce, is send a message not just to the Chinese generals or Mao Zedong, their dictator, but to all the Chinese, that if they didn't surrender immediately, he was going to destroy them, presumably with nuclear weapons. And this, of course, did not sit well with President Truman, and so he fired General MacArthur, who came back to a great hero's welcome. The country did not agree with President Truman. When General MacArthur got off his plane in San Francisco, he was met by 200,000 or 300,000 people, and there were great ticker tape parades in New York, and he addressed a joint session of Congress, which is very, very rare. I think the last person to have done that was, if it wasn't President Roosevelt, it was Winston Churchill at the very beginning of the war. And he made a wonderfully emotional speech. It was called the "Old Soldiers Never Die, They Just Fade Away" speech. And it was so emotional, in fact, that it prompted the Speaker of the House to remark, there was not a dry eye on the Democrat side, nor a dry seat on the Republican side. General MacArthur lived in the Waldorf Astoria after that. He was a very, very well-known, famous man, and he enjoyed attending plays and lived with his wife, Jean. He had a young son, and shortly before his death, he was asked to address the Cadet Corps at West Point, which he did in a speech that is worth quoting here, and which is the end of my speech. The 88-year-old MacArthur, I beg pardon, I misread it, 82-year-old MacArthur, told these young soldiers that war was an awful abomination, that he personally would like to see it abolished. But then he quoted Plato, who has written, "Only the dead have seen the end of war." And then he said, "The shadows are lengthening for me, the twilight is here. I listen vainly, but with thirsty ear, for the witching melody of bugles blowing, of faraway drums beating the long roll, the call to battle. In my dreams, I hear the crash of guns and the rattle of musketry, the strange and mournful music of the battlefield. But in the evening of my memory, always I come back to West Point. Always there echoes and re-echoes in my ears duty, honor, and country. Today marks my final roll call with you, but I want you to know that when I cross the river, my last conscious thoughts will be of the Corps and the Corps and the Corps." Thank you. Thank you, great audience. There are little questions. Anybody got a question? I ask myself questions. I've done that.
Go up to the mic. So I enjoyed the aviators. I look forward to this. What's next?
Well, it's a good question. The Aviators was the book that I did before this. Charles Lindbergh, Eddie Rickenbacker, and Jimmy Doolittle, and the generals. And I've been talked into doing the admirals, and it didn't take a whole lot of doing it. I did it first, but then being around, these are some really interesting guys. These are the fighting admirals. It's not the usual. Usually they do Admiral King and Admiral Nimitz. They're great, but I wanted the guys who are actually in the ships. And so I'm sort of in the very beginning of absorbing that large amount of material that you have to do before you sit down and write. Yes, sir.
Really, two questions. Why did you leave Eisenhower out of the title? And then the second question was Bradley. Why did you leave him out?
I'm sorry, what?
Bradley.
Bradley.
Omar Bradley.
That's a very good question. I've been asked it a lot, and but I've got the answer. I wanted to write about it. I was successful in the Aviators with 3 guys. If you start getting more than that, you get in a literary wrestling match. And I wanted somebody in the Pacific, and that obviously would be General MacArthur. Of course, in the European theater, General Eisenhower was paramount, but he was not a fighting general, whereas General Patton was. Besides that, General Patton was a lot more interesting. And I wanted somebody in the middle, and that would be General Marshall, because he was really the brains behind the whole war effort, and also his relationships with General Patton, who was very difficult, and General MacArthur, who was very difficult, I think bore a telling. So General Eisenhower, of course, is all in the book, and so is General Bradley, but they're just not in the focused on the 3 that are in the title. Question? Yes.
In your research, did you find that MacArthur bore any blame for being caught flat-footed when the Korean War started? I'd read that he'd been kind of isolated from the intelligence that was available, and
well, that is a very good question. And also, he got caught flat-footed in the Philippines.
yeah, that's true.
But I mean, military intelligence sometimes they say is a non sequitur. I don't. I've had to deal with it a lot personally. I did, years and years ago. And there's so much coming in, and so much is unpredictable. If we had the sort of intelligence capabilities today, if they had that then, and what we have today, it wouldn't have been any of that. But the North Koreans, when they came in, they didn't use tanks at first. They didn't use anything that could be detected by planes or that kind of reconnaissance. And so they managed to simply sneak up and attack before anybody knew they were going to do it. And somebody's always got to take the blame, but there was nobody else in the Pacific, and that's where General MacArthur commanded the Far East. Who else would you get to fight it? I mean, you could have canned him for not knowing it, but that wouldn't have done you much good, because then you wouldn't have the Incheon landing and so on. I mean, these are all hindsight questions, and they're good questions. It's just that nobody really will ever have the answers.
Thank you.
Sir, you mentioned that that the 2 generals, MacArthur and Patton, had something of an ego. Was the return of MacArthur to the Philippines that film shot several times?
I have never. That's a good question. Well, the ego question is, General MacArthur used the press more or less like a unit of his own outfit. And the way they did that in the Second World War is they assigned reporters to specific units. And then those units would assign them out to do this. MacArthur courted the press. He knew how to do it because he wanted them on his side so he could complain about the lack of support he was getting from Washington, which in fact he was getting very little support from Washington, not because of himself, but because President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill had agreed on a Germany first policy very early on, before America was even in the war, that they were going to send the majority of their supplies and material and personnel to the European front. But MacArthur, because of that, had developed almost paranoia about the way he was being treated, and so he realized that these newsreels were a terrific way to get Washington to act. And there have been accusations when General MacArthur landed on, I don't know whether it was a Leyte landing, it was somewhere, it may have been Leyte, but he simply stepped off. Well, they were supposed to land at a dock, but they couldn't get to the dock. And the LCT that, or whatever it was he was in, hit on a reef. The water's about 3 feet deep, said the ramp went down. He got out and walked across the water up to the beach. And his staff followed him, and there were pictures taken of that. And there were later, I don't know what you call it, accusation or what, that he staged that again, just like they did the flag at Iwo Jima. But I have seen absolutely no evidence in all the reading that I've done, and I didn't really go after that. I don't care whether he staged it or not, doesn't matter. It was a great picture, no matter when he did it. But that he had, done this when his troops were already inland and he was safe on the beach. But I have not seen any evidence. I've seen suggestions and allegations in books, but I haven't seen anybody come out and said, yeah, we did that. So if that answers your question, best answer I can give you. Who else? Anybody?
Rickenbacker was in the Pacific for 24 days floating around on a raft, as some people know. He was sent there to tell MacArthur to get in the line and shut up. Once Rickenbacker went down for that extended period of time and he was in the hospital, whatever happened to that conversation? Because I read a great deal about Rickenbacker, but nobody has ever said if there was a meeting other than hi there or what happened. What actually happened?
This is a good question. Let me give you a little background on that. Eddie Rickenbacker, all those guys actually that I wrote about in the Aviators were World War I era guys. When the Second World War broke out, they wanted to get involved in it. And the way Eddie Rickenbacker got involved was they offered him actually a 2-star commission as a general. And he said he didn't want it because he didn't want the military, telling him what to do. So he was just Captain Eddie. And of course, he was one of the most famous aviators there ever was. And what they were using him for was sort of a special, well, 2 things. He'd go around to Air Corps bases. It wasn't an Air Force yet separately, it was the Air Corps, and just give pep talks. He was real good at that. He owned Eastern Airlines by that point. And he was also charged with the Secretary of Defense charged him with taking really top secret stuff that they didn't want to commit to airwaves or any other waves to tell commanding generals things. And one of the things that has been suggested, Eddie Rickenbacker went out to see General MacArthur when he was in New Guinea. And his plane ran out of gas because it got lost. The big B-17, it ditched in the ocean. He spent 23 days in a life raft with sharks and no food and all that. I mean, it's a whole story in itself. But the question was, what was he supposed to tell MacArthur, and did he tell him? Now, there's so many conflicting accounts of that. One of the things that he was said to have been told to tell MacArthur, as he said, was to be quiet and quit complaining in the press, that General Marshall was getting angry and the Secretary of Defense was getting Another thing that I heard was that he was told to tell General MacArthur that the Americans are about to invade North Africa, which is a very top secret thing, giving the time and so forth, the date. But whatever it was, after he was rescued, he spent about a week in a hospital, maybe 10 days, eating ice cream, getting his weight back. He lost 40 pounds. And he went out to see General MacArthur. And the story is, and this is not from either MacArthur or Rickenbacker, but from a third party, that he got out of the plane that took him to New Guinea. It was a terrible hole there in Port Moresby. Nothing but red dust and insects and so forth. MacArthur came to meet his plane, and Rickenbacker got out, and MacArthur came over and gave a huge hug. Eddie, I'm so glad to see you. Come on in. And so they had about 3 or 4 days of conversation. And what was said, they took it to the grave. Who else has a question?
Can I ask you a question about Forrest Gump?
Why not?
Okay.
Ask me about everything else.
What prompted you to write that book?
Money? No. There's no real, what prompted me, I guess, is I was living in New York and I was coming back to Mobile, Alabama in the winters to see my father, who was getting rather old. He was in his 80s. And on one of those occasions, we were having lunch somewhere, and he began to reminisce about, he was born in 1906, and he began to reminisce about in his childhood, there was a young man in the neighborhood who was retarded, they called it then. And the kids used to tease him and throw sticks at him and chase him. And one day, this young man's mama bought a piano, and they saw the piano go in the house, and about a day or so later, gorgeous music came wafting out of the windows, and so the kids decided that was good enough. They go take him under their wing and protect him. And I thought, I just seen a 60 Minutes show about something called the idiot savant syndrome, which is where a person basically can't tie their own shoes, but they can do amazing mathematical calculations and musical things. And so I went back that evening. I thought, I'm going to take some notes, write some notes. I may be able to use this as a scene somewhere in a book down the road. And by late that night, I had done the first chapter of Forrest Gump. And I can't explain it. It came what I call a lizard brain, which is back here in the back of your neck. And it just goes right through this brain here and onto the 10 feet. It sort of wrote itself. So that's where it came from.
I'm a product of public education locally, high school graduate class of 78. In my high school terms, we learned virtually nothing about World War I and World War II. It was all about the Civil War. I have 2 college-age children. Their knowledge of these generals is probably zero, other than playing with Green Army men, and maybe their grandparents named those Army men, Eisenhower, and talked about Patton a little bit. All they know about it is Anne Frank. How do you feel about multiple generations not knowing this great history and the military lessons that go with what you do?
It's unfortunate. The Civil War shaped the history of the United States. The Second World War shaped the history of the world. And to not teach these things and teach them in an effective and proper way is revolting. I don't know how else to say it. When I was in high school, we did have a pretty good evaluation of World War II. World War I was less, but it was certainly there because World War I reshaped them. We're fighting these people over there in the Middle East right now. It's because of World War I. They redrew all those boundaries just arbitrarily, and it made everybody mad. And so I don't, what one does about this, I don't know. I think it takes committees of angry people. Maybe it takes pitchforks and torches. But, somebody needs to change these things. I think we got time to take, maybe one more question?
I don't have a question, but I have a statement.
Oh, good. Always like that.
Welcome to Norcross.
Thank you.
You have solved a great Christmas gift problem for my 93-year-old dad. He ended the war as a captain under Patton. To this day, he plays golf twice a week in Florida, and he's
Really?
driving up here for Thanksgiving. This solves a great problem. There's only so many golf balls you can buy somebody.
That's right.
But he said, and will say to this day, that the two smartest men in the Army are the Georges, Marshall and Patton.
I think he's probably right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Take that far seat over there, that'd be great. Thank you again. If you would line up here to the left, he will stay as long as it's necessary.
They sent him a book. He didn't even know he was there.
Picture with the David.